The dress was white, which Sera thought was the most dishonest thing about the entire evening. Everything else was at least accurate. The church was cold. The guests were strangers. And the man waiting at the altar had eyes that moved through a room the way a calculation moved through a ledger, assessing, categorizing, arriving at conclusions she wasn't invited to see. The dress, though white, implied something about the occasion that the occasion did not warrant. White implied choice. She walked down the aisle on her father's arm, which was another technical inaccuracy, because her father's arm was a surface rather than a support. He was holding it out in the formal way of a man completing a transaction, his eyes directed slightly to the left of the altar where, she suspected, he had already located the person at the reception who would confirm his debt had been discharged. She had stopped expecting her father to look at her sometime around her 14th birthday. She was 23 now, and the expectation had been gone long enough that its absence was not grief, but geography, the simple fact of a space that had never been filled. The way a room without windows was not a tragedy, but simply a room without windows. The church held approximately 120 people. She knew none of them. She had been told by her father's lawyer 3 weeks ago, in the way that information was delivered in her family factually. Briefly, without the assumption that she would have questions that the wedding would be attended by associates of the Vale family, and that her own guest list was not a component of the planning. She had not asked who the Vale family was. She had known, in the peripheral way that anyone living on the edges of a certain world knew things. That Vale was a name that occupied a particular kind of space in the city, not a name you saw in newspapers or heard in police briefings, but a name that moved through certain conversations, like a current, felt before it was identified. She had also known, in the same peripheral way, that when a name like that requested your presence, the requesting was not the sort that invited negotiation. Her father had told her about the arrangement on a Tuesday evening, sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee going cold. In the tone he used for information rather than conversation, the Dunne family owed a debt to the Vale organization. The debt had accumulated over 4 years through a series of business decisions that her father described as unfortunate and that she understood. From the numbers she had seen in the household accounts, she quietly maintained, as the result of choices that were not unfortunate, so much as they were choices made by a man who had never been good with money and had spent 20 years refusing to acknowledge this. The Vale organization had, through channels her father did not specify, indicated that the debt could be settled through a formal arrangement between the families, a marriage. His younger daughter. She had sat across the kitchen table and she had looked at her father and she had done the calculation she had learned to do since she was 14. What is the available option here? And what does it cost? The available option was yes. The cost was the life she had been constructing quietly in the margins of her father's house, the accounting work she had built into a small but sustainable income. The apartment she had been planning to move into in 4 months. The specific, private version of the future she had been assembling piece by careful piece. All of that was the cost. She had looked at her father and she had said, with the evenness of someone who had long since learned that evenness was the most efficient way to move through the world, all right. She had not cried. She had gone to her room, and she had sat on the edge of her bed, and she had thought about the apartment she would not be moving into, and about the clients she would have to transfer to another accountant, and about the version of the future that was no longer available. And then she had stood up and begun making a list of what she would need to do to prepare for the wedding in 3 weeks, because the list was something she could act on, and the other things were not. And Sera Dunne had always been better at acting than at sitting with things she couldn't change. The man at the altar was taller than she expected. She had seen a photograph, a single photograph, taken at some public event, printed in a financial publication that covered the legitimate side of the Vale organization's holdings, which were considerable and real, regardless of what else existed alongside them. In the photograph, he had looked contained, which was the word she had settled on, not cold, not formal, but contained, like a room where everything was in its exact right place because someone had decided precisely where each thing belonged. In person, in the church, at the end of the aisle where the candles were burning and the guests were assembled. He was contained in exactly the same way. And he was watching her walk toward him with an attention that was different from the attention of the 120 people around him. The 120 people were looking at a wedding. Emeric Vale was looking at her. She did not know what to do with the difference. She reached the altar. Her father placed her hand in the air in the general direction of Emeric's and withdrew. Emeric took her hand, not her father's gesture. Not a transfer, but a deliberate taking. Careful, as if he understood that the hand was a particular thing and not simply an appendage. His hand was warm. She registered this with the specific attention she gave to unexpected data. He was watching her face, not the priest, and she met his eyes for the first time at a distance of approximately 18 inches and discovered that the calculation she had expected, the ledger-moving assessment, was there. But underneath it was something else she had not anticipated, and that she was going to need considerably more time to identify. The priest began to speak. She looked at the priest. She said the words she was required to say. He said the words he was required to say, in a voice that was low and even, and that held its own particular quality of precision, as if each word had been individually considered before being deployed. They were married at 6:47 in the evening, in a church she had never entered before and would never enter again, in front of 120 people she did not know. And she felt the ring on her finger the way you felt, a new fact not comfortable yet, but present, undeniable, real. The reception was held in a room adjacent to the church that had been transformed by people whose job was transformation and who had done it, with the thoroughness of professionals paid to ensure the result could not be mistaken for anything other than what it was intended to be. She moved through it beside him. He had placed her hand in the crook of his arm after the ceremony, and she had left it there because removing it seemed more declarative than letting it remain. And she observed the room the way she had always observed, rooms from the edges of her attention while appearing to look at the center of it. She saw the way people adjusted when he entered a conversation. She saw the way they did not adjust around her. She was new, unknown, a variable that had not yet been classified, and she understood that this was both protective and temporary. That the moment she was classified, the adjustments would begin for her as well, and that what she was classified as would depend entirely on what she did in the next few weeks and months, and whether she understood the room well enough to do it correctly. She did not know yet whether she understood the room. She was learning its grammar. He spoke to her 3 times during the reception, once to ask if she wanted champagne, which she did not but accepted because declining felt like a statement she was not ready to make. Once to introduce her to a man whose name she immediately filed away as someone whose handshake told her more than his words did. And once, toward the end of the evening, when they were briefly standing without anyone else in immediate proximity, when he said, quietly, "You've been reading the room all evening." It was not a question. She looked at him. She said, "Is that a problem?" He said, "No." He paused. "It's useful." She considered this. She said, "I'm not trying to be useful." He said, "I know. That's why it is." He moved to greet someone else, and she stood with her champagne and thought about that exchange for the remainder of the reception. Turning it over, the way she turned over numbers that didn't immediately resolve. The drive to the Vale estate was silent, not uncomfortably. He sat on his side of the car and she sat on hers, and neither of them performed anything for the other, which was its own kind of relief after 3 hours of a reception where performance had been the primary activity of every person in the room. She looked out the window at the city going past, and she thought about the apartment she would not be moving into. And then she thought about the ring on her finger. And then she thought about the 2-hour drive ahead of them. And she let herself sit in the specific quiet of a situation whose outcome she genuinely could not predict, which was unusual for her and which she was choosing, for now, to experience as information rather than threat. The estate was north of the city, behind gates that opened without visible mechanism when the car approached. The house itself came into view gradually, the way significant things presented themselves in increments, allowing the eye to adjust. It was old stone and careful maintenance, a building that had been designed to last and had been treated accordingly. She looked at it through the car window and she thought about the bones of it, the proportions, the way the light fell on the front facade in the early winter dark. And she thought that whoever had built it had understood something about permanence that was increasingly rare. Her room was on the 2nd floor. Not their room, her room, with an adjoining door that was closed. She had not expected this, and she did not know what to make of it. So she set it aside and focused on the room itself, which was large and simply furnished and had windows that faced east. Someone had placed a small arrangement of white flowers on the dressing table. She looked at the flowers for a moment. She thought about the white dress and the white flowers and all the white things of the evening that were meant to mean something, and that meant, to her, primarily that she was now in a situation that required she develop a new set of operating principles as quickly as possible. She was standing at the window, still in the white dress, looking at the grounds below in the darkness, when the knock came at the adjoining door. It was light, 3 brief sounds, not demanding. She said, "Come in." He opened the door and stood in the frame, and he did not enter. He looked at her across the room in the white dress at the window, and he said, "I want to be clear about something before tonight." She turned to face him. She waited. He said, "Nothing about this evening is required of you that you haven't specifically agreed to. If you want me to close this door and open it again only when you're ready, I'll do that." She looked at him in the doorframe. She said, "And if I don't want that," he said, "then tell me that." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the ledger eyes and the careful handshake and the "you're reading the room is useful" and the way he had not filled the silence in the car with words that were not necessary. She thought about the apartment she was not moving into and the accounting clients she was no longer serving and the future that was no longer available. She thought about what was available instead, and what it was, and what it might cost and what it might not. She said, "Come in." He came in. He crossed the room and stopped at a distance that was near but not presuming, and he looked at her with the attention that was not the ledger calculation, but the other thing underneath it, the thing she had not yet found a name for. He said, "May I?" and he gestured, very slightly, toward the fastening at the back of the dress, because she had been standing at the window for 20 minutes, in a dress that had 12 buttons running from the nape of her neck to the base of her spine, and that she had not been able to reach. She said yes. He turned her gently, by the shoulders, and he worked the buttons from the top. His hands were careful and impersonal, and thorough in exactly the way of a person who understands that careful and impersonal is not a contradiction in terms, but sometimes the most considerate combination available. When he finished, he stepped back and she held the dress against herself, and he moved to where he had been standing before, and he said, quietly, "May I continue 3 words?" She stood with the dress and the question, and the 23 years of a life that had proceeded without anyone whose question required. Her answer truly required it, in the sense that the answer would change what happened next, and she thought about what it meant to be asked, and what it meant to have an answer, and what it meant that the answer was hers to give. She said, yes, she was not afraid after that, not of him. She had been afraid of the word husband, and of the transaction, and of being in a room with a person she did not know, and being required to be something she had not agreed to be. But he had asked, and she had answered, and the answering had changed the shape of the room, and the shape of the evening, and the shape, she thought, of whatever came after. She did not love him. She was not pretending she did. But she was present, which was something she had not fully expected to be, and he was present in return, in the specific way of a person who was entirely in the moment they were in, and not rehearsing anything, or performing anything, or managing anything. And the combination of those 2 presences in that room produced something that she did not have a word for, but that felt, unmistakably, like the beginning of something. She did not know of what. She thought she might want to find out. She thought that wanting to find out was more than she had walked in with, and that more was a place to start. She woke in the morning to pale winter light through the east-facing windows. He was not there. On the table beside the door she had not closed last night, which was its own data point, there was a small tray, coffee, toast, and a card in handwriting that was as contained as everything else about him. It said, "Breakfast at 8 in the East dining room. If you prefer to eat in your room today, ring the bell on the left." Below that, after a space, last night was. And then he had crossed something out, carefully, and written, instead, "Good morning." She stood with the card and the coffee and the east light, and she thought about what had been crossed out, and decided she would not spend the morning speculating. And then she thought about it anyway, and she did not mind. She set the card on the tray. She drank the coffee. She thought, I do not know what this is, but I think I would like to know. She went to the east dining room at 8. She had not rung the bell on the left, which was its own decision. Small and private and entirely hers. The east dining room was smaller than she expected, not the formal dining room she had anticipated, which she would later learn was a different room used for different occasions. But a comfortable space, with windows on 2 sides and a round table set for 2. He was already there, standing at the window with coffee, and he turned when she came in. And something in the way he turned, not startled, not performing, just the natural motion of someone aware that the room had changed, was the first thing about him that she would later identify as having landed differently from everything else. He said, "Good morning." She said, "Good morning." She sat down. He sat down across from her. The food was already on the table in the way of a household that had been running for years and understood its rhythms. She poured herself coffee and she looked at the view through the windows, the grounds in winter morning light, the trees still holding their shape against the pale sky, and she thought about what to say that was honest, without being more than was appropriate for 8 in the morning on the first day. She said, "The windows face east." He said, "Yes. The house was built to catch the morning light on this side. The architect had a specific philosophy about which rooms should have it." She said, "What was the philosophy?" He said, "That the rooms where people began their days should have the most useful light. And that useful light was light that changed as the morning progressed, rather than staying constant." She thought about this. She said, "So that you could track the time without a clock." He looked at her. He said, "Yes, exactly." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "You understood that quickly." She said, "Numbers and light operate on similar principles. The rate of change tells you where you are." He looked at her across the table with the not calculation expression, the one she had been collecting data on since the altar, and he said nothing for a moment. And the nothing had a quality. She was not accustomed to the quality of a person who had heard something and was holding it carefully rather than moving past it. She turned back to the window. She thought, this is also data. The first week was an education in the grammar of a household she had not previously known existed. The estate had a staff of 11, 9 of whom she met in the first 3 days, and 2 of whom she did not meet until the 5th day, because they kept hours that ran counter to the rest. The cook, whose name was Mrs. Vale, and who had the disposition of someone who took her work seriously enough that she had not needed to take anyone else seriously in 20 years, assessed Sera on the first morning with the efficient thoroughness of a person deciding whether a new element was going to be useful or disruptive, and then handed her a copy of the week's menu and asked if there were adjustments. Sera looked at the menu and made 3 small adjustments based on what she could tell about the household's existing preferences, and Mrs. Vale looked at the adjustments and said, "Fine," which Sera later learned was the highest form of approval in Mrs. Vale's vocabulary. Aldrich she met on the 3rd day. He was not a large man, but he occupied space in the specific way of people who were accustomed to being exactly where they needed to be, no excess movement, no unnecessary presence. A quality of being there that was more about precision than size. He came to find her in the library, where she had been conducting her own quiet survey of the household's reading materials, which she had learned long ago was one of the most reliable ways to understand a person. He said, "Mrs. Vale." She said, "Sera is fine." He said, "Sera." Then he said it without hesitation, which was itself informative. He said, "I wanted to introduce myself properly. Aldrich. I handle operational matters for Emeric." She said, "What kind of operational matters?" He looked at her for a moment and she saw, in the look, the specific quality of someone recalibrating upward. He said, "The kind that require someone who is good at seeing what most people miss." She looked at him. She said, "That's a very diplomatic description." He said, "It's accurate." She said, "I'm sure it is." She looked back at the shelves. She said, "The library is organized by subject rather than author. Someone spent a long time thinking about that." He said, "He did. When he was about 14. She looked at the shelves and thought about a 14-year-old boy reorganizing a library by subject. And she thought about what kind of mind did that, and she thought, contained, the same word as before. She said, "Thank you for introducing yourself." He said, "Of course." He left. She stood in the library and thought about Aldrich and what he was and what he knew and whether. Eventually, she would find out how much. She thought about it again on the 7th evening. When she and Emeric had their first dinner, that was not the technical performance of the first morning or the careful navigation of the first few evenings, but something that was beginning to approximate actual conversation. He had asked about the accounting work, which she had mentioned once, briefly, in a way she had not expected to be remembered. He asked specifically, not generally interested in her past, but asking about the mechanics of it, what the work involved, what made it satisfying. She told him. She told him about the way a set of books that balanced correctly produced a specific kind of satisfaction, the satisfaction of a system that was honest with itself, where every number had its correct place and the whole told a story that was accurate. He listened with the full attention she was becoming accustomed to from him, the quality of a person who was genuinely receiving what was being said rather than waiting for his turn. When she finished, he said, "What's the most interesting set of books you've worked with?" She thought about it. She said, "A bakery that had been running for 30 years. The owner had never been to school and kept her records in a system she invented herself. It took me 2 weeks to understand the system, and another week to realize it was more sophisticated than anything she would have learned formally." He said, "What did you do with it?" She said, "I kept her system and translated it into the standard format for tax purposes. I didn't change the underlying logic. It was better than what I would have imposed." He said, "You left the original structure intact." She said, "It worked. The purpose of accounting is accuracy, not conformity." He looked at her over the dinner table and she saw, for the 3rd or 4th time, the not calculation expression, and this time she thought she was beginning to understand what it was. It was the expression of a person who had not expected to find something and was encountering it. She looked back at her plate. She thought, "I think I am beginning to understand him." She thought I should be careful about thinking I understand things too quickly. She thought, "But I also think the understanding is accurate." She ate her dinner and she looked out the window at the winter grounds, and she thought about what it meant to be in a situation that was not the one you had planned for, and to find that the unplanned situation contained things the planned one had not, and what the honest accounting of that looked like. The 2nd week was different from the 1st, in the way that the 2nd week of anything was different from the 1st, not dramatically changed but shifted. The initial strangeness beginning to smooth into something that, while not familiar, was at least legible. She learned the rhythms of the house. She learned that Emeric was in his study by 6 in the morning, and that this was not insomnia but preference, that he was a person who thought most clearly before the rest of the world had accumulated enough noise to interfere with thinking. She learned that the household took lunch at 1 regardless of what else was happening, that Mrs. Haverley considered this non-negotiable, and that Emeric agreed with her in the specific way of a man who understood that some structures were worth maintaining precisely because they were structures. She learned that the library was where she was most comfortable, and that he seemed to know this without being told. Because twice in the 2nd week, she found things on the library table that were not hers, a financial quarterly she had mentioned in passing, a set of architectural drawings of the estate that she had not asked for, but that she had been thinking about asking for, placed there without comment, without the expectation of acknowledgement. She acknowledged them. She thought that was the right call. On the 9th day, she found her way to his study at 7 in the morning. Not because she had decided to go, but because she had been walking through the east wing and had arrived at the door and had knocked before she had consciously decided to knock. He said, "Come in," and she came in, and the study was what the library had told her to expect, organized by a system that was entirely his and that she could see. Looking at the shelves and the desk and the arrangement of the working materials was a system she could learn if she wanted to. He was at the desk, and he looked up when she came in, and he did not ask what she wanted. He waited. She said, "I wanted to ask about the estate accounts." He said, "What about them?" she said. "I've seen the household ledgers that Mrs. Haverley uses for day-to-day expenses. They're functional, but they have inefficiencies I could address if you wanted." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "The estate accountant does the formal accounting." She said, "I know. I'm not suggesting I replace the formal accounting. I'm suggesting that the household management layer, which feeds into the formal accounts, has gaps that create extra work for the accountant on the other end." He said, "What gaps?" she told him. She had been noting them for 9 days. not because she had intended to, but because her mind had moved through the household's financial information the way it moved through everything, finding the structure, identifying where the structure had been assembled imprecisely. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "The estate accountant has mentioned these issues." She said, "What did you do about them?" He said, "Nothing, because identifying the problem is easier than finding someone who can address it without disrupting the existing structure." She said, "I can address it without disrupting the existing structure." He looked at her. He said, "I know." He said it with the quality of a person who had known before she said it. And she thought about Aldrich and the library and the quarterly on the table, and she thought, how much has been already understood about me, and from when? She said, "All right then." She left the study. She came back with a notepad. She sat in the chair to the left of his desk, and she began working through the household management layer. And he continued with whatever he had been doing before she arrived. And neither of them commented on the fact that they were now working in the same room, which was its own data point. She worked in the study for 4 hours that first morning. She came back the following morning and the morning after that. By the end of the second week, it had become, without announcement or discussion, the way the mornings worked. She was in the study by 7:30 with her notepad, and he was at his desk, and the room held both of them in the way that rooms held things that belonged in them together, without requiring anyone to acknowledge the arrangement. She thought about the accounting principle of sunk costs, the idea that what has already been invested should not determine what you do next, that the honest accounting was always of the present value, not the historical cost. She thought about this in the context of the white dress and the church and the transaction her father had completed, and she thought, the historical cost is what it is. What is the present value of this? She did not know yet. But she was in the study at 7:30, and that was a data point. On the 14th evening, she came into the bedroom from the adjoining door for the second time on her own initiative. She had been in and out through the connecting door every night since the first. But always after he came to knock, the established rhythm was his knock and her response, and then the door. That evening she went through the door before he knocked. He was reading, seated in the chair near the window, and he looked up when she came in, and he did not say anything, only moved the book to his lap and waited. In the specific way she had learned was how he received information he had not anticipated quietly, with his full attention and without performance. She said, "I didn't want to wait for the knock tonight." He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "All right." She thought that all right from him was not a small concession. She thought it was the largest one available in his vocabulary. She was beginning to understand his vocabulary. The understanding was, she thought, reciprocal. He was also learning hers. This seemed important. She was not afraid of him. She had been afraid of the idea of him, which was the version constructed from her father's nervous explanations and the weight of the Vale name in certain conversations. The actual Emeric Vale, the one who reorganized libraries at 14 and left financial quarterlies on tables without comment and said, "All right," with the weight of someone for whom all right meant more than the words "this person was not frightening." He was. She was discovering something more complex and more interesting than frightening, which required a different set of operating principles than fear, and that she was developing, day by day, with the same methodical attention she applied to household accounts. There was a social event in the third week, a dinner hosted by an associate of the Vale organization, held at a property on the south side of the city that had the quality of places designed to communicate authority without stating it directly. She had worn the right dress and said the correct things, and moved through the room beside him with the peripheral attention she had deployed at the reception, and that, she was beginning to understand, was not only a personal habit, but a professionally useful capacity. She watched the room. She watched the other guests watch Emeric. And she watched the way his presence organized a social space, the way a fixed point organized a coordinate system. Everything else located itself relative to him. She watched a man across the room, whose name she did not know, and whose attention pattern was different from the others in a specific way she could not immediately name, but that her attention flagged and retained. On the drive home, she said, "The man in the gray suit, the one standing near the east wall for most of the evening, Emeric," without looking away from the road, said, "Oscar," she said, "he was watching you the way the others were watching you. But the others were watching to see what position you were in. He was watching to see what position you didn't know you were in." There was a silence. Emeric said, "That's a precise observation." She said, "It's what I saw." He said, "Yes." He did not say anything else for a moment. Then he said, "Peter Oscar is a councilman who has specific interests in the Vale organization's territory that conflict with our current operational structure." She said, "Is he a threat?" He said, "He's working toward being one." She said, "What kind of threat?" He looked at her briefly. "The calculation." "Not calculation. Look," before returning his attention to the road. He said, "The kind that prefers leverage to confrontation." She thought about the word leverage, and what kinds of leverage a person like Oscar might be seeking, and she filed the information in the way she filed financial data, not acted on immediately, but retained in the correct category for when it became relevant. She said, "I'll watch him if we see him again." He said, "All right." She looked out the car window at the city going past in the dark, and she thought about useful and about what it meant to be that in a context she had not chosen, and that she was honest enough to acknowledge this, at least to herself, becoming invested in anyway. The investment was not what she had expected. She had expected to negotiate a survival. She was discovering she was, apparently, negotiating something else. 2 days after the dinner, she was in the library when Aldrich appeared in the doorway with the specific quality of someone who had come for a purpose rather than in passing. He said, "Do you have a few minutes?" she said. "Yes." He came in and sat in the chair across from hers, which was a thing he had not done before. He had stood in the doorway of the library the first time, and stood in corridors on the subsequent occasions, and she noted the sitting as a change in the category of the conversation. He said, "You have good instincts about people," she said. "I've had a lot of practice at watching." He said, "Oscar is going to try to talk to you at some point without Emeric present." She looked at him. She said, "Why are you telling me this?" he said. "Because you should know what kind of conversation it's going to be before you're in it." She said, "What kind is it going to be?" He said, "The kind where someone offers you information that is partially true, arranged in an order designed to change how you understand what's already happened." She thought about this. She said, "What information?" He looked at her for a moment, with the recalibrating expression she had seen on the first day, and he said, "Things you should probably hear from Emeric. But he has a specific relationship with that kind of telling." She said, "What kind?" Aldrich said. "He knows what to say. He has trouble with when." She looked at the library shelves. She thought about the quarterly on the table and the architectural drawings and the 3 words on the first night and the crossed-out line on the morning card. She thought about a man who communicated through left objects and careful actions and words chosen with the precision of someone for whom imprecision was a different kind of lie. She said, "I'll keep that in mind." Aldrich stood. He said, You're managing this better than anyone would have predicted, she said. Anyone who predicted was working with the wrong data. He looked at her for a moment with something that was almost a smile, which was, she suspected, his version of a significant expression. He said, "Yes, I suppose they were." He left. She sat in the library with the information he had given her and the information he had withheld, and she thought about Oscar and the leverage he was building toward, and what form it would take, and when, and she added it to the ledger she was keeping in her head, the one that was not made of numbers but of people, and what they wanted, and what they were willing to do to get it. She had been composing the ledger for 23 years. It was the most reliable accounting system she had developed, and it had never yet failed to give her an accurate picture of the situation she was in. She reviewed the current entries. Emeric, a person of considerable complexity, operating from a position of genuine power, who had, for reasons she did not yet fully understand, made her a specific and deliberate choice. Aldrich, loyal to Emeric, but not blindly, principled in a way that was practical rather than abstract, currently extending her a form of trust that she thought he extended rarely. Oscar, a threat of the leveraging variety, currently building the information architecture required to apply pressure, planning to approach her specifically because he understood that she was new enough to be potentially uncertain about her position. Her father, irrelevant to the current situation, which was both the saddest and the most pragmatic conclusion she had reached in the last 3 weeks. The household, learning to accept her with the specific speed of a household that took its operational cues from its principal, who had accepted her, and whose acceptance was therefore being extended. Mrs. Haverley, the closest thing to an ally she had found so far, who was not also someone with a specific interest in the outcome of her situation. She thought about allies and what she needed them for, and what she could offer in return. And she thought that the most honest thing she could offer was accuracy, the same thing she had always offered. In every accounting she had done, she could tell the truth about what she saw. That had always been her most reliable skill. She thought it was going to be the most relevant one here, on the evening of the 17th day. After dinner, sitting in the east drawing room where the fire made the room feel smaller and warmer than it was in daylight, she said to Emeric, without looking up from the estate accounts she had been reorganizing, "Tell me something you haven't told anyone in this house." He looked up from what he was reading. He said, "That's a specific request," she said. "I'm a specific person." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "The library. I reorganized it when I was 14 because I had been reading in a particular order and I wanted to preserve the order so I could come back to it." She said, "What order?" He said, "Everything about a subject before moving to the next. History before, philosophy before, mathematics before, architecture before everything else." She said, "Did you finish?" He said, "I'm still in architecture." She looked up at him then, and he was looking at the fire, and she thought about a 14-year-old boy building a system that would take him past 37 years old to complete. And she thought that this was the most specific thing she had learned about him, and that it told her something fundamental about what kind of person kept all things in their correct place. She said, "I've never read systematically. I read whatever is interesting at the moment." He said, "How do you know what's interesting?" She said, "It presents itself. You recognize it." He said, "You trust that?" She said, "It hasn't failed me yet." He looked at her then, away from the fire, and the expression was fully the not calculation one, the one that had no ledger in it at all. He said, "No, I imagine it hasn't." She held the look for a moment and then looked back at the accounts. The fire continued. The room held them both in its winter warmth. She thought, I think the present value is higher than I estimated. She thought I should update the ledger accordingly. The social calendar of the Vale household, she discovered in the 3rd and 4th weeks, was not the calendar of people who socialized for pleasure, but the calendar of people for whom social presence was operational. Events appeared with regularity and purpose, and the purpose was rarely stated, but always legible, once you understood the grammar of the world you were in. She attended them all. She had made this decision after the first event, after the observation about Oscar, after Aldrich's appearance in the library doorway, the decision that the most honest position available to her was full engagement. Because partial engagement was a form of dishonesty, a way of keeping one foot outside the door of a house you were already living in, and she had never been able to reconcile dishonesty with her own accounting standards. She was here. She was going to be here. The only remaining question was what kind of here it was going to be. Emeric noticed. She knew he noticed because he was the kind of person who noticed everything, and who occasionally let her know he had noticed by asking a question whose specificity made the noticing visible. He asked, after the 3rd event, about a conversation she had had with a woman named Danvers, whose husband held a position in the city's commercial licensing structure, and who had let slip, in the way of someone who was used to letting things slip because no one in her usual social circle was paying close enough attention to catch them. A piece of information about an upcoming regulatory review. Sera had filed it and said nothing. Emeric had asked about it on the drive home, and she had told him what she'd heard, and he had been quiet for approximately 30 seconds, which she was learning was his version of a significant reaction. He said, "How did you get her to say that?" She said, "I didn't. I asked her about her daughter's school." She was grateful to talk about something she cared about rather than something she was supposed to care about. The regulatory information came out in the middle of talking about the school. He said, "You gave her a genuine conversation to make her comfortable." She said, "I was genuinely interested in her daughter's school. It has an unusual approach to mathematics education that I found interesting." He looked at her. He said, "Both things were true simultaneously." She said, "They usually are, if you're paying attention." He turned back to the road. She looked at the city. She thought about the accuracy of the statement, and about what it would mean if the same principle applied to her current situation, if the things that were functionally useful and the things that were genuinely felt were not in different columns but in the same one, and if the accounting she had been performing was not the right accounting because it was keeping separate things that belonged together. She thought about this for 3 days. She thought about it while working in the study in the mornings, and during the events in the evenings, and in the East dining room over the breakfast conversation that had become the most reliable constant of her days. The breakfast conversation was the thing she looked forward to most, which was an observation she allowed herself to make without immediately analyzing it. He brought things to breakfast the way he left things in the library without announcement. Just present. Available. Offered without expectation of specific reception. One morning, it was a question about a financial model she had mentioned the previous week. Another morning, it was a piece of news from a city he had been to once, and that she had mentioned wanting to visit, delivered as if the city had reminded him of her, which was the kind of thing that arrived and had to be set aside carefully because otherwise it took up too much space. Another morning, it was nothing. They sat in the east light and ate and looked at the grounds and said nothing for 20 minutes. And the nothing was as full as any conversation she had had in the previous year. She had not expected to find this. She had expected to negotiate a tolerable existence inside an arrangement she had not chosen. She was finding she was being honest about this, because she had no reliable operating system that did not include honesty. She was finding something that was not tolerable in the sense of endurable, but tolerable in the sense of a system that worked. that had internal logic, that told a story she could follow. She was in a house with a man she did not yet love, but that she thought she was beginning to understand at a level that was deeper than the ledger calculation she had assigned him on first sight. And the understanding had a quality she associated with the best accounting work she had done, the satisfaction of a system that was honest with itself, where everything was in its correct place, and the whole told a story that was accurate. She thought about what it meant that she was experiencing his household as good accounting. She thought that it meant he was more like her than she had initially calculated, and that this was the data point that was changing everything else. On the 21st day, she found Oscar in the estate's outer courtyard. She had gone out in the late afternoon with the specific intention of the kind of walk. That was not for exercise, but for the recalibration of perspective that came from being outside a building and able to see it whole. The courtyard was at the front of the estate, between the main gate and the house, and she had not expected anyone to be there. Oscar was standing near the gate, which was closed, in the manner of someone who had arrived and been told to wait, and was performing the waiting without performing the waiting. If that distinction made sense, he looked like a man who had chosen to stand exactly where he was standing, rather than a man who had been placed there. He said her name. She said his. She considered. She said, "How did you get through the gate?" he said. "I have an appointment with Emeric at 4. I was early." She looked at the gate, and then at him, and she thought, that may be true. She said, "He's in his study." Oscar said, "Yes. I was told to wait." She was about to say she would tell him Oscar was here, as the functional next step, when Oscar said, "May I ask you something? While we have a moment." She thought about the library doorway. She thought about information that was partially true, arranged in an order designed to change how you understand what's already happened. She said, "You may ask. I may not answer." He looked at her, and she saw something in the look that was recalibration. He had expected a different response. She thought. He had expected less precision. He said, "Did your husband tell you why he chose you specifically for this arrangement?" She said. "He told me the arrangement was made with my family to settle a debt." Oscar said, "That's the mechanism. I'm asking about the reason." She said, "They're the same thing." Oscar said, "Are they?" She looked at him. She said, "I think I'll let him know you're here." She turned and went back to the house. She did not look back. She told Aldrich, who was near the entrance, that Oscar was waiting in the courtyard, and she went to the study, and she knocked, and she went in, and she said, "Oscar is in the courtyard. He says he has an appointment at 4. Emeric looked up. He looked at her face, not at his desk. He said, "Did he speak to you?" She said, "He asked if you'd told me why you chose me specifically for the arrangement." He said, "What did you say?" She said, "That the mechanism and the reason were the same thing." He said, "And then?" She said, "I came inside." He looked at her for a long moment with the full, unguarded expression, the one with no ledger in it at all. And then he said, "I'll deal with the appointment." She said, "All right." She left the study. She went to the library. She sat in her chair and she opened the financial quarterly that he had left on the table, and she did not read it because she was thinking about did your husband tell you why he chose you, and about the mechanism and the reason being the same thing, and about whether she had given the correct answer, or whether the correct answer required information she did not yet have. She thought she might be missing something. She thought she was going to need to find out what it was. That evening, at dinner, she said, without preamble, "What happened at the meeting with Oscar?" he said. He presented a set of concerns about the Eastern distribution arrangement under the guise of an informal consultation. The concerns were not the actual purpose of the meeting. she said. What was the actual purpose, he said. To see how I reacted to a specific pressure point, while he had a secondary observation in progress. She said. Which was, he said, you. He wanted to know how I responded when I was aware that he had spoken to you. She thought about this. She said, What pressure point? He said. He implied that the Vale organization's credibility in certain negotiations was contingent on the perceived strength of its principal's domestic arrangements. She understood what that meant. She said, He was testing whether I was a vulnerability. Emeric said. Yes. She said. And what did your reaction tell him? He said, That I noted the test, without showing that I noted it, which tells him I'm aware of the strategy without giving him information about how I intend to respond. She said, That's useful. He said, It's standard. She said, No. The fact that your first concern when Aldrich mentioned Oscar was whether he had spoken to me, that's not standard. That's specific. He looked at her across the dinner table. She held the look. She said, I'm not asking you to explain it right now. I'm noting that it's a data point. He said, In your ledger. She said, Yes. He said, What else is in the ledger? She said, A great deal. Some of it I understand. Some of it I'm still developing the right category for. He said, What category is the most uncertain? She looked at him. She said, The one that would require information I don't have yet to classify correctly. He said, What information? She said. The kind that you know how to say but have trouble with the when of. She saw him pause a brief, complete pause. The kind that told her the words had landed. He said, Aldrich. Not a question. She said, He told me you had that quality. He didn't tell me what the information was. He said, No, he wouldn't. She said, I'm not asking tonight. He said, I know. She said, But I will ask. When I'm ready. He said, All right. She looked back at her dinner. She thought that the all right had the same weight as the first one, the one on the 14th evening. She thought she was very slowly learning the specific gravity of his words, and that the learning was its own form of intimacy, the intimacy of a vocabulary acquired rather than received. She thought she did not mind the acquiring. She thought she might. In fact, prefer it. She slept well that night, which was something she noted because she had not always slept well in the first weeks. The specific anxiety of being in an unknown situation with unknown stakes had a physiological expression that she had become accustomed to in her 20s, the 3A. M. Wakefulness. The inventory taking that her mind performed when it had nothing else to do. The inventory had been taking less time lately. She thought this was because the inventory was getting shorter, not because there was less to account for, but because the categorization was improving, the filing becoming more efficient. She was getting better at knowing where things went. She thought that knowing where things went, in this particular situation, was going to matter more than she had initially estimated. She adjusted the estimate accordingly and went to sleep. The 23rd day was the day the morning conversation shifted permanently. She had come to the study with a question about a discrepancy in the estate accounts. From 14 months prior, a historical entry that didn't correspond to any project she could identify in the household records, and he had looked at it and said, "The East Garden." She said, "There's no East Garden." He said, "No, it was planned. The contractor failed to complete it, and the funds were partially recovered but not fully. The unrecovered portion is what you're seeing." She said, "What happened to the garden?" He said. "The plan was abandoned." She said, "Why?" He said, "It was designed for someone who wasn't here anymore." She looked at the account entry, and she thought about a garden planned and abandoned, and an entry that was neither completed nor removed. just existing in the books, as a record of something that had been intended. She said, "Your wife." He said, "My first wife." "Yes." She said, "I didn't know there had been one before." He said, "It was brief. She died." She said, "I'm sorry." He said, "It was 6 years ago." He said it with the specific quality of someone for whom 6 years had been sufficient to integrate the fact, but not to make the integrated fact weightless. She understood this. She understood the difference between time that healed and time that simply accumulated around a thing until the thing was no longer in the foreground. She said, "Should I correct the entry?" He looked at the account. He said, "Yes, close it out. It's accurate as a record, but it creates confusion in the current picture." She wrote a note to do so. She said, "What was her name?" He said, "Elena." She said, "Was she also an arrangement?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "No. She was. I chose her without the frame of any arrangement. The choice was less considered than it should have been. When she died, I made a decision that subsequent choices would be more deliberate." She looked at the account entry. She thought about deliberate and what it meant to be a deliberate choice, and how that was different from being an arranged one, and whether the difference mattered less than she would have assumed 3 weeks ago. She said, "What made me the deliberate choice?" He looked at her across the desk. He said, "A question I'm not quite ready to answer today." She said, "But you will answer it." He said, "Yes." She said, "All right." She made the correcting note. She continued with the accounts. He continued with his work. The east light moved across the room the way it moved every morning, tracking time without a clock. And she thought about Elena and the abandoned garden and deliberate choices and the information she did not yet have. And she thought that she was accumulating the context required to receive it when it came, and that the accumulation itself was its own form of being chosen. The large event, the one that was larger than the dinners and receptions she had attended so far, the one that required a different order of preparation, was held at the end of the 4th week at the Vale organization's primary social venue, a property in the center of the city that had the quality of places that had been designed to impress, and had been doing so for long enough that the impression was now less about the original design than about the accumulated weight of everything that had happened inside it. She had been briefed, in Emeric's characteristically efficient manner, on the guest list, the purpose of the event, and the 3 specific interactions he would need her present for, not as a participant but as an observer, because she had demonstrated, twice now, the capacity to observe in ways that were useful. And he was. She recognized this for the significant operational trust it represented, deploying that capacity deliberately. She had not been asked. She had been included, which was different. She wore a dress that was not white. She had made the decision about the color independently, and she thought the decision was correct. White, at this stage, would have been a performance of the wedding, of the transaction, of the before. And she was past the before. The dress was a deep green that she had not owned before this marriage, and that she had acquired from the allowance that had appeared in a household account without discussion, which was the way most things of this nature appeared in the Vale household as a fact, requiring no negotiation because the negotiation had already occurred somewhere she had not been present for. She was becoming more at ease with this. She thought that was significant. The event was substantial in every dimension: the room, the guests, the specific density of significance in the interactions happening simultaneously throughout the space. She moved through it beside Emeric for the first hour and beside his left shoulder for the second, which was a position she had discovered gave her slightly better sightlines to the room while remaining within the conversational orbit that his presence created. She watched. She held conversations when they were directed at her and held her own in them, which she had discovered was expected, and which she had discovered she was capable of. She watched Oscar, who arrived 40 minutes into the event with 2 men she did not know, and whose body language she read as the body language of people, who were there for a specific purpose, and who were not yet in the part of the evening where the purpose would be executed. She watched Oscar navigate the room. He was good at it, not as good as Emeric, who navigated by existing in the room in a way that made the room navigate around him, but good in the specific way of a man who had spent years learning to appear to be doing something other than what he was doing. She watched him move through 3 separate conversations, and she noted, in each one, the specific moment when the conversation shifted from social to operational, a slight forward lean, a lowering of the register, the other person's posture changing in response. She noted the names of the people he shifted register with. She filed them. She was building a picture of his network from observation, the way she had always built pictures of financial structures by finding the connections, identifying the direction of flow, understanding what was moving and where it was going. At some point in the 3rd hour, Emeric was drawn into a conversation that required his full attention, and she found herself briefly without the gravitational anchor of his presence and navigating the room on her own, which she did with the calm of someone who had made a decision about full engagement and was executing it. She acquired a glass of water from a passing server and moved to the east end of the room, which had a view of both the main entrance and the secondary conversation area. And she stood there and she watched the room with the settled attention of a person who was, she realized, entirely comfortable in her own observation. Oscar found her there. She had not been surprised to be found. She had been wondering how he would approach, whether he would be direct or whether he would use a social pretext. He was direct. He came to stand beside her with the ease of a man who had decided that directness was the more efficient option. And he said, "You've been watching the room all evening." She said, "I've been watching you, watching it." He looked at her. She thought she saw the recalibration again, the adjustment upward that had appeared in the courtyard. He said, "Then you understand something about how these rooms work." She said, "I understand how information moves through them." He said, "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the room. He said, "I imagine Emeric has told you a great deal about me." She said, "He told me you prefer leverage to confrontation." Oscar said, "That's accurate. He's perceptive." She said, "Yes." He said, "Has he told you why you're here, specifically? Not the mechanism, the reason behind the mechanism." She said, "We've discussed it." He said, and she said, "I don't discuss my conversations with my husband, with people he's described as building toward being a threat." Oscar looked at her. She held his look. He said, "You're more than he presented." She said, "He didn't present me. I'm not a presentation." He said, "No, you're not." He said it with a specific quality she had not expected from him, not admiration, not its performance, but the specific acknowledgement of one precise person encountering another. He said, "I'm going to tell you something I know, not as leverage, as courtesy to someone who is operating with incomplete information and whose operating environment would benefit from the completion." She said, "I'm skeptical of that framing." He said, "You should be." He said, "But it doesn't change that what I'm about to say is true." She said, "Then say it." He said, "Your husband chose you from a situation he arranged to observe. He identified you 6 months before the arrangement with your family was proposed. He approached your family with the debt resolution as the mechanism because it was cleaner than the alternative, which would have required him to pursue you through channels that would have made the choice visible in ways he wasn't prepared to make visible." She did not react. She held her expression with the evenness she had practiced for 23 years. She said, "What was he observing?" He said, "A market in the Harran district. About 6 months ago." She held that. She said, "Why are you telling me this?" He said, "Because you are a variable he has chosen to treat as a person. I am someone who needs him to treat variables as variables. This information, depending on how you receive it and what you do with it, serves my purposes." She said, "You're being honest about the self-interest." He said, "I'm being efficient. You would have identified it anyway." She looked at him. She said, "You're right. I would have." She said, "Thank you for the courtesy of acknowledging it up front." She set her glass on a nearby table. She said, "Excuse me." She moved back toward the center of the room. She found Emeric in the conversation she had left him in, and she came to stand at his left shoulder, and he did not look at her, but his hand moved, briefly, to the small of her back. The lightest possible pressure. A recognition, and she thought that she had information now that required understanding, and that the understanding was going to require a conversation that she was not going to have in this room tonight. She was going to have it when she had organized the information properly and was ready to ask the questions that were actually hers. The drive home was quiet in the way of people who have both accumulated something during an evening and who are choosing to hold it until the right moment. She looked out the window at the city. He looked at the road. At some point he said, "Oscar spoke to you." It was not a question. She said, "Yes." He said, "What did he tell you?" She said, "Something about a market in the Harran district." The car was very quiet for a moment. She heard him exhale a controlled, deliberate exhale, the kind that was not a sigh, but was the physiological equivalent of a decision being made. He said, "I was going to tell you." She said, "I know." She said, "I want to hear it from you. Not tonight, but I want to hear it from you. And I want the full version, not the managed one." He said, "All right," she said. "And Emeric?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Whatever the reason is, whatever happened at the market in the Harran district, I need to know that my receiving the information is not the same as my endorsing the method. I can hear it and still have an opinion about whether arranging an observation before arranging a debt resolution was the right approach." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Yes, that's fair." She said, "Good." She looked out the window. She said, "I thought you should know that Oscar told me openly that the information served his purposes. He didn't try to hide the self-interest." He said, "That's unusual for him." She said, "I think he recalibrated. He realized the indirect approach wasn't going to work." He said, "He was right." She said, "Yes." She looked at the city going past in the dark, and she thought about the market in the Harran district and 6 months, and an observation and a choice that had been made before any arrangement was proposed. And she sat with what she didn't know yet. And the sitting was not comfortable, but it was honest. And she had always been better at honest than comfortable. He was gone the following morning before she came downstairs, an early departure. Aldrich told her, for something that required his physical presence outside the city. 2 days. She received this, and she thought about 2 days, and about the information she was holding, and about what she was going to do with 2 days in the estate. Without the specific, organizing presence that she had not fully understood, she had grown accustomed to until it was temporarily absent. She went to the study. She sat at her usual chair. She worked through the accounts with the attention she always brought to them. And the work was good. And the room was quiet, in the specific way that rooms were quiet when their primary occupant was not in them. She thought about what the primary occupant quality of a room felt like. and she thought that she had not expected to feel someone's absence in a room so specifically, and she thought that this was also a data point that required proper categorization. On the afternoon of the first day, she went to the library and pulled the book she had been reading, a history of architectural philosophy that she had found on the shelves, and that was good, and she sat in her chair and she read, and she thought about the entry about Elena and the abandoned East Garden and the choice that had been less considered than it should have been, and she thought about what a more considered choice looked like, and whether being a considered choice was something she could hold without resentment for the method. She was honest about the resentment. She thought she had a right to it. She also thought that the resentment and the other things, the breakfast conversations and the left quarterlies and the study mornings and the all right with its specific gravity, were not in different columns. They were in the same column, and they were going to have to be totaled together. She thought she was beginning to understand what the total was going to be. She was going to wait until she had the full information before she confirmed it. On the evening of the second day, before Emeric returned, Oscar came to the estate, not with an appointment. The gate security called the house to confirm admission, and Aldrich told her, and she said let him in and came downstairs herself, which she thought was the correct decision, and which she thought Aldrich confirmed in the brief quality of the look he gave her before he stepped back. She met Oscar in the entrance hall. He said, "He isn't here." She said, "No, you knew that before you came." He said, "Yes." She said, "Then you came to talk to me." He said, "I came to offer you an additional piece of information." She said, "You said the information was as a courtesy." He said, "The first piece was, this piece is more specifically useful to me." She said, "Then I'm less interested in it." He said, "I think you should hear it anyway." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because it changes the picture in a way that favors you, and I want you to know that I understand that." She looked at him. She thought about the evening at the event and his directness and his acknowledgement of the self-interest. She said, "Then say it directly." He said, "The arrangement your father made the debt. The resolution mechanism your husband engineered the debt, not the original accumulation. That was your father's own doing, but the specific terms that made marriage the available resolution. He structured those." She held this. She said, "He made the arrangement possible." He said, "He made it the only reasonable option your family had." She said, "That's a significant piece of additional information." He said, "Yes." She said, "Why does this favor me?" He said, "Because it means he wanted the outcome badly enough to engineer the path to it, not as a convenience or an efficiency, as the only outcome he was willing to accept." She looked at Oscar across the entrance hall for a long moment. She said, "And it favors your purposes because," he said, "because if you are someone he has invested this level of effort and specificity in securing, you are someone who has a specific kind of value to him. People with that kind of value can be used as leverage in ways that standard arrangements do not create." She said, "You're telling me how you intend to use me." He said, "I'm telling you how I would intend to use you if I believed it would work. I'm also telling you this because I don't believe it will work anymore, and I think you should know why." She said, "Why won't it work?" He said, "Because you are not someone who can be used without their knowledge and cooperation, and I don't believe you'll cooperate." She looked at him. She said, "No, I won't." He said, "Then we understand each other." She said, "Yes." She said, "Oscar." He said, "Yes." She said, "When Emeric comes back tonight, I'm going to tell him exactly what you told me. Both conversations, everything." He said, "I expected nothing less." She said, Then why have the conversations? He said. Because I learned something valuable from them. About what you are and about what he's chosen. And that information will change my approach, she said. To what end? He said. A more sophisticated one, she said. That sounds like a threat. He said. It's an honest description of a change of strategy, she said. Leave. He left. She stood in the entrance hall for a moment in the quiet of the estate, and she thought about what she had just heard, and about what it meant, and about the conversation she was going to have when Emeric returned, and she thought that she was ready for it now, in a way she had not been ready for it yesterday. She had what she needed. She went back to the library and picked up the book. She read until he came home. He returned at 9 in the evening. She heard the car and she closed the book, and she came to the entrance hall and he came through the door and he looked at her standing there and he said, without preamble, "What happened?" she said. "Oscar came while you were gone. He went very still," she said. "He's been here twice now. Once when you were traveling, and once before that with an appointment. I let him in tonight because I wanted to hear what he had to say," he said. "Are you all right?" she said. "Yes. Come, sit down." They went to the east drawing room. He did not sit. She did. She said, "Sit down. I need to tell you what he said to me tonight, and then I need to ask you something, and I need you to be sitting when I ask it." He sat. She told him both conversations. She told them accurately and completely, including the parts where Oscar had acknowledged his own self-interest, and the parts where she had told him she would report everything to Emeric. She held nothing back. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "He told you I engineered the debt terms." She said, "Yes," he said. "That's true," she said. "I know. That's not why I needed you sitting," he said. "Then why?" She said, "Because of what he said about the market in the Harran district. And because I have been waiting to ask you about it for 3 days. And because now I want the full version." He looked at her across the drawing room. He said, "The market in the Harran district." She said, "Yes. 6 months ago. You were there. I was there. Something happened," he said. "Something happened that you were in the center of, and that you apparently don't know I witnessed." She said, "Tell me." He said, "There was a dispute between 2 men with weapons over a transaction that went wrong. A child was caught in the middle of it, not involved. Simply in the wrong place. Everyone else in the market moved away from the child. Everyone understood, correctly, that the safest response was distance." He stopped. She waited. He said, "You moved toward the child." She was quiet. He said, "You walked between the child and the man with the weapon. You didn't know either of them. You didn't have anything to use as protection. You just moved." She said, "I remember." She said, "I remember thinking it was probably not the right calculation." He said, "It wasn't, probabilistically." She said, "But the child was there." He said, "Yes." He said, "That's what I saw. That's what I've spent 6 months understanding what I saw, and the only conclusion I've arrived at is that it was the most honest thing I'd witnessed in 15 years of working in a world where honest things were rare, and I couldn't make it make sense in the framework I use for everything else. And the only response that seemed appropriate was to find a way to know who you were." She looked at him across the drawing room. She said, "So you arranged the debt resolution." He said, "Your father's debt existed. The terms that made marriage the available resolution, those I structured." She said, "You should have approached me directly." He said, "Yes." He said it without defense. She said, "You should have asked." He said, "Yes." She said, "Why didn't you?" He said, because asking would have meant explaining why I was asking. And explaining why I was asking would have meant showing you something I wasn't sure I had the right to show someone I didn't yet know. She said, "What would you have been showing me?" He said, "That I had been looking. That I had watched you do something that I didn't have a category for, and that I'd spent 6 months trying to build one. That the looking had changed something I thought was fixed." She said, "And showing that felt like too much." He said, "Yes." She said, "It still was too much. The method." He said, "I know." She said, "I had a life I was building." He said, "I know. I've thought about that a great deal." She said, "Did you account for it? Before you structured the debt terms?" He said, "I thought about it. I told myself it would be better." He stopped. He said, "No, I'll give you the honest version. I thought about what I wanted. I didn't think about the life you were building sufficiently. I told myself the arrangement would offer you security and stability in exchange for what you were giving up. And I let that accounting be enough, because the alternative was either abandoning the approach entirely or finding the courage to do it directly. And I chose the third option, which was neither of those things." She said, "The coward's option." He said, "Yes." She looked at him. She said, "Emeric." He said, "Yes." She said, "The child at the market. If I had known someone was watching, if I had known there were consequences to the choice, I would still have moved toward the child." He said, "I know." She said, "I want you to know that whatever you thought you were selecting for, it wasn't contingent on the observation. It wasn't a performance." He said, "I know that too. That's part of what made it what it was." She said, "All right." She looked at the fire. She said, "The method was wrong, and I want that acknowledged formally, between us, as something that required acknowledging." He said, "I acknowledge it, fully and without qualification." She said, "Thank you." She said, "Now, what do we do about Oscar?" He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted. Not the not calculation expression. Something new. Something that combined the two expressions she had catalogued and produced. A third she had not seen from him before, and that she thought was the expression of a man who had just received something he had not fully expected to receive, and who did not yet know how to name it. He said, "Together," she said, "you said I was useful for reading rooms. Oscar just told me his entire strategy in 2 conversations because he recalibrated and decided I was too sharp for the indirect approach. I think that's information worth using." He said, "Yes." He said, "Together." Then they sat in the drawing room until 11 that night, which was later than either of them typically stayed up. Planning. She had not expected the planning to feel the way it felt, which was like working on a set of books together, finding the structure of a problem, identifying where the connections were, understanding the direction of flow and what was moving and where it was going. He thought in terms of networks and pressure points. She thought in terms of patterns and anomalies. The combination was, she noted with the specific satisfaction of a system that was working correctly, more complete than either approach alone. They developed a strategy for the upcoming month that addressed Oscar's leverage-building approach at its foundation, rather than responding to individual pressures as they appeared. And at the end of it, she looked at what they had built together on the pages of her notepad, and she thought, "This is the most I have felt like a full participant in anything in 23 years. She thought, "That is also a data point." She thought, "I am going to need a new ledger category." She closed the notepad. She said, "I'm going to bed." He said, "All right." She stood. She said, "Emeric." He said, "Yes." She said, "The East Garden, if you ever want to finish it." He looked at her. She said, "Not for any reason other than the original reason it was planned. But if you want to," he said. "I'll think about that." She said, "Good." She went upstairs. She came through the adjoining door, which she had been doing on her own initiative for 10 days now, without knocking. She did not knock. She was in the room that was hers in the way she chose things to be hers, not by transaction but by accumulation, by the specific kind of ownership that came from being present in a place long enough that you knew where the light fell at different hours and which floorboards spoke, and what the grounds looked like under the 3 kinds of winter weather the month had so far produced. She stood at the east window for a moment. She thought about the child at the Harran market and the move she had made toward it without calculating the probabilities, which was perhaps the most instinctive thing she had ever done in a life organized largely around calculation. She thought about what it meant that the most instinctive thing she had ever done was the thing that had changed everything. She thought about instinct and calculation and whether the best accounting was always the one that acknowledged both. She thought probably yes. She thought update the model accordingly. She got into bed. She looked at the ceiling in the dark and she thought about together and what it had meant when he said it and what it was going to mean in the coming weeks and beyond the coming weeks. And she thought, I am going to find out. I am choosing to find out. The choice, like the child at the market, is mine. She woke the next morning with the specific quality of clarity that came from a night in which the right decisions had been made before sleep, and the sleep had confirmed them. She came to the east dining room and he was already there. And the morning conversation was different from the previous mornings, not because the subject matter was different, but because the position of both of them in relation to the subject matter had changed. They were no longer 2 people in a new arrangement, learning to navigate each other's grammar. They were 2 people who had had a specific conversation and who were on the other side of it. And the other side was a different country. She thought, this is what it feels like when a ledger column changes everything. She poured her coffee. She said, "The approach to Oscar that we discussed last night, I want to start on my end today." He said, "What's your end?" she said. "The network mapping. I identified 6 separate conversations at the event that I think are nodes in his information-gathering structure. If I develop relationships with those 6, I can tell you what information is moving and where it's going before it reaches him." He said, "That will require you to be present at more events." She said, "I'm already committed to full engagement." "This is an extension of that," he said. "It's more risk." She said, "Oscar already recalibrated. He knows I'm not ignorant of the situation. The risk from further engagement is less than the risk of withdrawal." He looked at her across the breakfast table. He said, "You've thought through the risk analysis." She said, "I do that automatically. It's the same as account reconciliation. You identify the exposure and then you decide whether the potential return justifies it." He said, "And in this case," she said, "the return is understanding the full picture. That justifies a considerable amount of exposure." He said, "Yes." He said, "The 6 contacts. Tell me who you're thinking of." She told him. With the names she had memorized and the reasoning she had developed for each, he listened and he added 3 more she had not identified, and she wrote them all down. And they sat in the east morning light with the list between them. And she thought, this is the work. This is what it means to be in this, fully, as a person and not as an arrangement. And she thought, I have never felt more accurately placed in my own life. She thought that the accounting of that fact was worth every complexity of the ledger it was entered in. The month that followed was the most operationally interesting period of Sera's life, which was not a category she had previously had occasion to use, but which she found, on reflection, Accurate. She developed relationships with the 9 contacts in Oscar's information network, with the specific patience of someone who understood that useful information was the product of time and genuine attention, not of interrogation. She attended events with the full engagement she had committed to and the full attention she had always brought to rooms. And she found, as the weeks accumulated, that the rooms were returning the attention, that she was becoming a known entity in them, someone people spoke to rather than around, someone whose presence at an event meant something beyond the transactional fact of her marriage. She thought about what it meant to become visible in a context where visibility was itself a form of power, and she thought that visibility had always been available to her, and that what had changed was her relationship to the spaces it was available in. Emeric noticed. He noticed everything, which she had long since accepted as a fundamental feature of him, like the library organization or the study at 6 in the morning. He noticed, and he told her when what he noticed was relevant, and he held things when they were not yet relevant. And she had come to understand the difference by the quality of the quiet between them. The study quiet was productive. The drawing room quiet was the quiet of people who were in the same space and at ease with it. And the quiet that preceded information was a different quiet, a held-breath quality that she now recognized as reliably as she recognized a discrepancy in a column of numbers. She would not ask during the held-breath quiet, because she had learned that the asking rushed something that needed its own time. And she had learned this the way she had learned most things about him, by watching the pattern and understanding the logic of it. He would tell her. He always told her. On the 38th day she had stopped counting deliberately, but the number arrived anyway. The way numbers arrived for her without being sought, he came to find her in the library at a time that was not their established time, which was itself the signal. She closed the book. He sat in the chair across from her, which Aldrich had sat in on the first important conversation, and which was, therefore, she had noted, the chair in this room that was used for significant things. He said, "Oscar is moving sooner than we expected." She said, "How soon?" he said. "There's an emergency council session being called for the end of the week. He's introducing a formal complaint against the Vale organization's distribution territory claims, framed as a conflict of interest with the council's regulatory oversight role." She said, "His legal basis," he said. "He's using the marriage as evidence of inappropriate proximity between the organization and a connected family. Specifically, your father's debt history with us." She said, "He's using the mechanism against us." He said, "He's using the fact that the mechanism was visible. If we had structured it differently," she said. "If it had looked less like a transaction," he said. "Yes." She thought about this. She said, "What are our options?" He walked her through them. She listened with the specific attention she brought to complex accounting problems, tracking the variables, identifying the dependencies, locating the point where the structure was most vulnerable and the point where it was most solid. She said, when he finished, "The strongest position is the one we haven't used yet," he said. "Which is," she said, "the truth." He looked at her. She said, "Oscar's complaint rests on the marriage being a transaction. If the marriage is demonstrably not a transaction, if we can establish publicly and in a context, he can't control the framing of that the arrangement had a different basis, his legal argument loses its most visible support." He said, "That would require making the heron market visible." She said, "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. She said, "I'm not asking you to do it. I'm telling you it's the strongest position and that I'm willing to be in it if you decide it's the right approach." He said, "The heron market makes me look," she said, like someone who observed a stranger do something honest and found it remarkable because genuine honesty was rare in your world, he said, or like someone who engineered a situation based on a single observation, she said, which is also true. And I've already acknowledged what was wrong with that, and so have you, and we're on the other side of that conversation. He looked at her. He said, "You want to use it?" She said, "I want to use the truth. The truth is that this marriage is not what Oscar is describing. And the reason it's not what he's describing is because of what happened at the Harran market, and because of what we've built since. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and using both of them is not dishonest." He was quiet for a long time. Not the held breath. Quiet. Something deeper. The quiet of a person who was making a calculation he had not made before, in a direction he had not previously identified as available. He said, "It would require you to speak, publicly, about what happened at the market, in a context where the people listening will be looking for weakness." She said, "I know." He said, "You're not afraid of that." She said, "I'm afraid of it. That's not the same as saying it's the wrong approach." He looked at her across the library, and she held the look, and she thought, this is what it looks like when two people decide something together. And she thought, I have been waiting to feel this my entire life without knowing I was waiting for it. He said, "All right." She said, "Then we have 3 days to prepare." He said, 2.5. "The session is Thursday." She said, "Then we start tonight." He said, "Tonight." She said, "Mrs. Haverley will have already started dinner." He said, "She'll understand." She said, "She absolutely won't. But she'll accommodate it because you'll ask her directly and she respects direct requests." He looked at her with the third expression, the new one she had been cataloguing since the drawing room conversation, and she thought that she was still developing the vocabulary for it, but that it had something to do with being accurately seen, with the specific quality of a person who was accustomed to being known for what he could do and was encountering, apparently for the first time, someone who was equally interested in who he was. She looked back at the library shelves. She said, "You're still in architecture." He said, "What?" She said, "Your reading system. You said you were still in architecture." He said, "Yes." She said, "What, specifically?" He said, "The relationship between structure and intention. Why a building communicates what it communicates." She said, "Have you found the answer?" He said, "I think the answer is that a building communicates whatever was most honestly understood when it was built, not what was intended, what was genuinely known." She thought about this for a moment. She said, "That applies to a great many things." He said, "Yes." She said, "Come on. We need the East dining room and Mrs. Haverley's inevitable hospitality." They went to the East dining room. Mrs. Haverley, informed that dinner would be a working session, produced a meal that was both excellent and structured for extended table time, which Sera thought was Mrs. Haverley's way of expressing approval without expressing it, and she thought she and Mrs. Haverley were perhaps more similar than she had previously estimated. They worked through the evening and into the night, building what Sera thought of as the honest accounting, a full and precise record of the Harran market, the subsequent 6 months, the arrangement as it had actually been, and what had constituted it, not a performance, not a narrative designed to produce a particular effect, a true account, arranged in the order that would be most comprehensible to people who did not know either of them and who would be looking for the leverage points Oscar had identified. She found, as they worked, that the true account was better than any constructed one would have been, which was the thing she had always found about honest accounting It was always more efficient than the alternative, because it did not have to account for its own inconsistencies. He told her things in the construction of the account that he had not told her before, not because he had been withholding them, but because the construction required their inclusion, and he gave them without reservation, and she received them in the same spirit. And by the time they finished, it was after midnight, and the house was quiet, and they sat across from each other in the east dining room, with the account between them, and she thought that what was between them was not only the account. She said, "This is good work." He said, "Yes." She said, "The honest version is always more efficient." He said, "I've been told that before, by someone who has not been wrong about it." She said, "Accurate accounting tends to hold." He said, "Yes, it does." She looked at the pages on the table and then at him. She said, "I'm going to bed." He said, "All right." She said, "Emeric." He said, "Yes." She said, "I'm glad you were at the heron market." He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "So, am I." She went upstairs. She came through the adjoining door, and she looked at the east windows in the midnight dark, and she thought about the child at the market and the move toward rather than away. And she thought that the most instinctive thing she had ever done had been the right calculation after all, and that sometimes the right calculation was the one that skipped the calculation entirely and simply moved toward what needed to be moved toward. She thought she was going to spend a long time thinking about that. She thought she was all right with a long time. The Thursday council session was held in a formal civic space that had the specific quality of authority maintained through continuity, old wood, and good light, and the accumulated weight of decisions made in the same room over many decades. She sat beside Emeric in the audience section while Oscar made his opening statement. And she listened with the full attention she brought to everything, and she read the room with the peripheral awareness she had been developing since the first event, and she understood, by the end of the opening statement, exactly what structure Oscar was building and where its load-bearing elements were. She leaned slightly toward Emeric and said, very quietly, "He's going to frame the mechanism as the entirety of the arrangement. He's not going to address what came before or what came after." Emeric said, equally quietly, "He doesn't know about before or after." She said, "He knows about the market. He told me." Emeric said, "He knows it happened. He doesn't know what it means to me." She said, "Then that's where we address him." He said, "Are you sure?" She said, "I'm a precise person." Oscar said so himself. "When I speak, the room will know I'm giving an accurate account." He said, "Yes." She said, "Then I'm sure." She waited for the correct moment, and when it arrived, the specific opening in the procedural structure where a response from the affected party was formally invited, she stood, and she spoke with the evenness of a woman who had been organizing her thoughts for 3 days and who had never in her life said more than what was accurate and never less than what was true. She described the Harran market. She described what she had done and why. In the specific way she described things, without embellishment, without the performance of emotion. In the language of a person reporting what had happened as accurately as she knew how, she described what she had learned about what Emeric had seen, and she said clearly and without softening it that the subsequent arrangement had been structured by him and that she had an opinion about the method which she had communicated to him directly and which he had acknowledged without qualification. And then she said that none of this, none of the mechanism or its construction or her opinion of it, changed what had been built since, and that what had been built since was not a transaction. It was a partnership, composed of the specific substance of 2 people who had learned each other's grammar and were still learning. and that this was available for anyone in the room to assess against their own understanding of what a transaction looked like and what it did not. She sat down. The room was quiet in the specific way of rooms where something honest has just been said and the audience is determining what to do with it. She did not look at Emeric. She looked at the front of the room. She heard him, very quietly. Exhale once. She thought that exhale contained approximately the same information as a full paragraph from almost anyone else she had ever known. And she thought that she was right about the efficient vocabulary. And she thought that she was going to be learning it for a very long time. The session concluded without a formal ruling in Oscar's favor. The procedural mechanism for which required a higher evidentiary standard than his opening statement had established. He would bring it again, she understood that. And Emeric had said as much on the drive home. But the framing he had been building toward was now addressed in the public record in a version he had not controlled. And the network nodes she had been developing relationships with for 4 weeks had all been present in the room. She thought about the direction of information flow and where it was going to go from the session. And she thought that it was going to go through 9 people who now had a more complete picture than Oscar had intended them to have. And she thought that the network mapping had been worth the month of effort. She thought this is good accounting. She thought, I am going to need to develop an entirely new chart of accounts for this life. She thought, I find this interesting rather than daunting, which is probably the most honest thing I have admitted to myself so far. On the drive home, she said, the East Garden. He said, what about it? She said, finish it. He said, that was planned for someone who, she said, I know who it was planned for. I'm saying finish it. It was a good plan. The design has excellent structural logic. The fact that the original purpose is no longer available doesn't mean the garden shouldn't exist. He looked at the road for a moment. He said, you've seen the plans. She said, I found them in the estate records. Whoever designed it understood load distribution. He said, Elena designed it. She said, she had good instincts. He said, yes, she did. He was quiet for a moment. He said, you want me to finish a garden designed by my first wife. She said, I want you to finish something that was started and not completed because of loss. I think things that were started well should be finished when possible. The loss doesn't disqualify the design. He looked at her across the car. She looked at him. She said, I am not afraid of what came before me. I am interested in understanding it correctly. He said, most people. She said, I'm not most people. You knew that at the Heron Market. He said, yes. He was quiet for a moment. He said, I'll have the garden finished in the spring. She said, good. She looked out the window. She thought about spring and what it would look like in the grounds of the estate, and what it would look like to have something finished in it that had been waiting to be finished for 6 years. And she thought about Elena and the design with the good load distribution, and she thought some things deserved to be completed. She thought, I am going to finish things. All the things that have been started and that were worth starting, this one included. They arrived home, and she went to the study, which she had begun to think of as their study in the specific way that spaces became shared when they had been shared long enough, not by declaration, but by the accumulated fact of presence. She sat at her chair, not at his desk, and she opened her notepad, and she began writing the analysis of the council session while it was still fresh. What had worked? What had been unnecessary? What Oscar's procedural response was likely to be, and what they should do about it. He came in 20 minutes later and sat at the desk, and he read the morning's correspondence without disturbing her. And the room held them both in its 6 in the morning quality, even though it was nearly 10 at night and the study lamps were lit instead of the winter daylight. She finished the analysis, and she slid it across the desk to him without comment. He read it. He said, "The third point, about Oscar's likely procedural response." She said, "The timing is an estimate. He'll move faster if he thinks the network has shifted against him." He said, "He'll think that. 3 of the 9 contacts were visible in the session." She said, "Yes, I know which 3. He said, "So do I." She said, "Then we agree on the timeline." He said, "Yes." He looked at the analysis for another moment. He said, "This is better than what Aldrich would have produced." She said, "Aldrich thinks in terms of threat response. I think in terms of structure. They're different tools for different problems." He said, "You've been working with him." She said, "I've been comparing notes. He's been generous with information." He said, "He doesn't do that unless he's decided someone is worth it." She said, "I know." She looked at him across the desk. She said, "He told me, the first time he came to the library, that you know what to say and you have trouble with when." He said, "Yes, that's accurate." She said, "You were accurate tonight. In the session, when you let me speak, you had the timing right." He said, "I had the timing right because you were ready, and I could see that you were ready." She said, "How?" He said, "You're very legible when you've made a decision." She said, "That's a vulnerability." He said, "Not in a room where you're the only one reading correctly." It was a strength tonight. She thought about legibility and what it meant to be readable by a person who was paying the right kind of attention. And she thought about what it meant to have one's legibility treated as a strength rather than an exposure. She said, "I'll update my assessment." He said, "Of what?" She said, "Of legibility as a variable." He said, "In your ledger." She said, "Yes." She gathered her notepad. She said, "I'm going to bed. The morning session we planned can start at 8 instead of 7 given the hour." He said, "8. Yes." She stood. She said, "Emeric." He said, "Yes." She said, "Whatever category you've been building for me since the Harran market, I think it's probably accurate now." He looked at her. He said, "The category I've been building has been called several things over the past 6 months, and none of them have quite fit. The most recent version is, he stopped." She waited. He said, "The most accurate one is the person the house is more correct with in it." She held this. She held it for a long moment because it was, she thought, the most him thing he had said to her, yet the specific vocabulary of a man who thought about buildings and the honesty of their construction, who had spent his adult life in a house that had been correct before and that had been less correct for 6 years, and who had, she was beginning to understand, spent those 6 years missing the correctness in the specific way that people who understood structures missed structural integrity when it was absent. She said, "That's a very precise compliment." He said, "I'm a very precise person." She said, "Yes, I know." She went upstairs. She came through the adjoining door, and she stood at the window for a moment, and she thought the house is more correct with me in it. And she thought, "I think that is true." And she thought, "I think it is also true in the other direction." And she thought, "That is the most honest accounting I have made yet of this situation. And it is also the most frightening one." And she was going to sit with both of those things and let them be simultaneously true. The way she had learned to let things be simultaneously true, in the best accounting the version that told an accurate story rather than a comfortable one. She got into bed. She looked at the east ceiling in the dark. She thought about the child at the Harran market and the move toward rather than away, and she thought, "That was the most instinctive thing I have ever done, and it produced the most considered thing my life has ever contained. And I am not sure those two things are in contradiction. I think they might be the same thing, seen from different ends of the same story. She thought, update the model. The model updated. She slept. The morning after the council session, she came to the east dining room, and he was already there, and the coffee was already made, and the morning light was moving across the table in the way she had been watching it move for 5 weeks, and that she had come to find as reliable as a well-maintained ledger. She sat down. She poured coffee. She said, I have a question. He said, yes. She said, the arrangement. The one you structured. If my father hadn't had the debt, if the mechanism hadn't been available, what were you planning to do? He was quiet for a moment. She said, I want to know. Not because it changes anything about where we are now, because I want the complete account. He said, I was going to find a different mechanism. She said, what kind? He said. I hadn't determined that. I knew the outcome I wanted and I was working backwards from it. She said, you were going to find a way regardless. He said, yes. She said, how long would it have taken? He said, I don't know. Your father's situation presented itself before I needed to answer that. She thought about this. She said, you were going to engineer my life regardless of whether my father gave you a convenient mechanism. He said, in the direction of introducing myself to you and creating conditions where knowing me was a reasonable option for you. Yes. She said, that's a significant amount of planning. He said, I'm a significantly planned person. She looked at him across the breakfast table. She said, at what point would you have told me? He said, at the point where it was relevant. She said, which you would have determined. He said, yes, which I understand is the same problem we've already addressed. She said, it is the same problem. She said, I want you to understand that the problem isn't the wanting. The problem is the unilateral decision about when I get to know I'm wanted. He said, I understand that. She said, tell me you understand it specifically, not as an acknowledgement of my position, as something you've actually integrated. He was quiet for a moment. He said, I understand it specifically because the alternative, the direct approach I didn't take, would have given you the information at a time when you could have made a fully informed choice to refuse. And refusing was something you were entitled to do, and that I was structuring around because I was afraid you would exercise it. She looked at him. She said, that's specific. He said, yes. She said, thank you. She said, I would not have refused. He said, what? She said, if you had come to me directly, after the market, if you had explained what you had seen and why it had mattered to you and asked whether you could know me, I would not have refused. He looked at her. She said, I'm telling you this not as comfort, as information. For your model, he said, duly noted. She said, good. She looked at the morning light on the table. She said, we have the session analysis to implement today. He said, yes. She said, and I have 2 of the 9 contacts to follow up with before Thursday. He said, I can accompany you to the Harwell lunch. She said, I know, but if you come, the conversation I need to have won't happen. They'll direct everything at you. He said, true. He said, Aldrich can. She said, I'll go alone. He looked at her. She said, I know how to be in a room. I've been in rooms alone for 23 years. He said, I know you have. He said, I don't like it. She said, I know you don't. She said, tell me when it's a genuine security concern and I'll take Aldrich. Don't tell me when it's preference. He said, yes. All right. She said, thank you. She finished her coffee. She said, the Harwell lunch is at noon. I'll have the contact analysis back by 4, he said. I'll be in the study, she said. I know. She stood. She looked at him across the table, and she thought about the direct approach that had not been taken and the one she was taking now, which was the direct approach in the direction of knowing exactly what she was in and what it contained and what she was choosing to do about it. And she thought that the direction of travel was, finally, the right one for both of them. She went to get ready for the Harwell lunch. The East morning light continued. The house was correct. The Harwell lunch produced 2 pieces of information she had not expected, and one she had. The unexpected ones were first. That one of the 9 contacts had a secondary connection to Oscar that ran through a financial instrument she had not identified in the network mapping, which meant the mapping needed to be updated and the contact reclassified. Second, that a woman named Caris Holden, who was not one of the 9 contacts and who had not been on Sera's list, had approached her after the formal lunch with the specific quality of someone who had been looking for an opportunity to speak without the opportunity being visible. Caris Holden, over coffee in a side room. He had told her that she had been at the council session and that she had spoken to 4 of the 9 contacts in the days since, and that she was in possession of information about Oscar's financial structure that would address the procedural mechanism he was preparing, and that she was offering this information to Sera specifically, and not to Emeric because, she said, she was tired of navigating this world through the men in it, and believed Sera understood. Why? Sera had received this with the seriousness it warranted. She had said she would need 48 hours before she could confirm whether to proceed. Caris Holden had said 48 hours was fine. Sera had come home and gone directly to the study. He had looked up from his desk and read her expression and said, "Tell me," she told him. He listened. He said, "Caris Holden." She said, "You know her," he said. "She was married to one of Oscar's former associates. She has knowledge of the financial structure from that period that would be genuinely damaging to his current position." She said, "She came to me." He said, "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "She's right that she would not have approached me with it. The history is—" He stopped. She said, "You don't need to give me the history right now. The question is whether we use what she's offering." He said, "It changes the timeline significantly. If her information is what I think it is, the Thursday session becomes the last session." She said, "And Oscar," he said, "managed in the way of our world." She said, "I want to know what that means specifically." Every time he looked at her, he said, "In this case, it means the information removes his political and organizational standing. The rest is consequence." She said, "Consequence that doesn't involve." He said, "No, not with Oscar. He's not worth the additional complexity." She said, "Then yes, we use what Caris Holden is offering." She said, "But I meet with her, not you." He said, "Yes." She said, "And I tell her that the reason we're operating this way is because she came to me, and I think that deserves to be honored." He said, "Yes, tell her that." She said, "Good." She went back to her chair and opened the notepad and added the Caris Holden contact to the network map and the secondary financial instrument to the Oscar analysis. And she sat for a moment and she looked at the updated picture and she thought, "This is a complete account. This is what it looks like when the accounting is honest from all directions." She thought, "I have been looking for this my entire career." She thought, with the specific surprise of recognizing something you had been expecting without knowing you were expecting it. "I have found it. Not in the accounting work. In this." In this house, and this man, and this study, and this work we are doing together, which is the most alive I have felt in my own life, and which I am choosing every day, with the full knowledge of what I am choosing." She looked at him at his desk, and he looked up, and their eyes met, and she thought, "I am going to keep choosing this." She thought, "That is the most honest accounting I have made." She looked back at the notepad. She updated the model. The model was good. The Thursday session was different from the first one in every dimension that mattered. Oscar had restructured his approach. She had expected this, and had told Emeric what form the restructuring was likely to take. And she had been mostly correct, which was satisfying in the specific way that accurate predictions were satisfying regardless of whether the accuracy was in your favor. He led with the financial argument rather than the domestic one, having understood from the first session that the domestic framing could be countered effectively, and he built his case on the structural analysis of the Vale organization's territory claims in a way that was technically rigorous and, she noted, genuinely well-researched. He was a competent adversary. She had always known this, and she thought he deserved the acknowledgement, even internally, even from someone who was about to dismantle his argument at its foundation. Karis Holden gave her testimony before Sera spoke. She had agreed to this ordering, and Sera had thought carefully about whether it was the right ordering, and had concluded that yes, the financial evidence needed to arrive before the account of it, because financial evidence had a specific authority in formal proceedings that personal account did not, and the ordering mattered for the reception of both. Karis Holden spoke with the specific quality of a woman who had spent years being in rooms where she was not supposed to have information, and who had the information anyway, and whose decision to deploy it now was not impulsive, but the result of a calculation she had been running for a long time and had decided was worth the consequence. She was precise and unsparing, and she gave Oscar no available angle of response, which Sera noted with the professional appreciation she gave to any system that worked correctly. Then Sera spoke. She spoke differently from the first session, not about the Harran market this time. Not about the domestic arrangement and what it was and was not. This time she addressed the financial argument directly, using the network analysis she had built over 4 weeks, naming the connections and the direction of information flow and the specific nodes through which Oscar's own financial structure intersected with the territory claims he was challenging, creating a conflict of interest that was on his side rather than on the Vale organization's. She had prepared this with the precision she brought to financial presentations that needed to be comprehensible to non-specialists, which the council members were. And she could see, as she spoke, the specific moment when each of them arrived at the conclusion the evidence was pointing toward. She did not rush them. She let the evidence do the work. She sat down. Emeric, beside her, was very still in the way. He was very still when something had happened that required the full capacity of his processing. He did not say anything. She did not expect him to. Oscar's procedural response came quickly and was, she thought, the response of a man who had assessed the situation and understood that the position he had built was no longer tenable, but who was managing the transition rather than the defense. He requested a postponement for additional evidence preparation. The council declined the postponement on procedural grounds. He acknowledged the conflict of interest with the specific language of a man who had lost, but who was not going to perform the losing publicly. She watched him, and she thought that he was better at this than most people would have expected him to be, and that she could respect the quality of the management even while being entirely pleased with the outcome. The session closed without drama. She gathered her papers. Emeric said, very quietly, "You're building a chart of accounts for a world you've been in for less than 60 days. She said, I told you. The system presents itself. You recognize the structure, he said. Yes, he said. The organization is going to want to understand what you are. She said, Tell them I'm the person who does the accounts. He said, That will confuse them. She said, Good. It'll give me time to get the books in order before they figure out the rest. He looked at her. She looked at the front of the session room. She said, Come on. We should speak to Karis Holden before we leave. He said, All right. Karis Holden was near the side entrance, talking to no one. With the quality of a woman who had completed a significant transaction and was in the process of assessing what it had cost and what it had produced, Sera went to her directly. She said, Thank you. What you did today required a specific kind of decision. Karis said, I've been making the decision for 2 years. Today was just the execution. She said, If there's anything we can do in return, Karis said. There is. Actually, she said, I want the East Garden, Sera said. What Karis said. When it was planted, the original designer, I knew her. I should have attended the opening and I didn't. And then the circumstances changed, and it was never finished. If you finish it, I'd like to be invited when it opens. Sera looked at her. She said, The garden will be finished in spring. Karis said, Good, she said. You're an unusual person, Sera said. I've been told, Karis said. So is he. You should know that. From someone who has been watching this world for 20 years, he chose correctly, which is something he had stopped being able to do for a while. Sera said, He's still working on the when. Karis said, Most people never get to the what. Give him credit for that much. Sera thought about this. She said, Fair, she said. Spring. Then they went back to the car. She sat in the passenger seat and she looked at the city and she thought about the East Garden and Elena's design and the good load distribution, and she thought, This is what completing things looks like. You come back to the original design, and you finish what was started, and you invite the people who should have been there the first time, and you let it be what it was always going to be. She thought, I am going to do that with everything in this house that deserves it. She thought, starting with the most important one, 2 weeks after the Thursday session. After the organizational consequences of Oscar's conflict of interest had been processed through the Vale Network's own mechanisms, and the territory dispute had been resolved through the procedural channels that Karis Holden's testimony had opened. After the 9 contacts in the network had shifted in the direction Sera had predicted, and after Aldrich had updated the threat assessment to reflect the changed landscape, and after Mrs. Haverly had made a specific meal that Sera had come to understand was her way of marking significant events, after all of this had settled into the house's particular rhythm. Sera came to the study at an unusual hour. Not 7:30 in the morning, not the usual evening working sessions, the late afternoon, when the east light had given way to the west, and the study was lit differently than she was accustomed to seeing it. Warmer and lower, and the quality of the room was different in a way she had not encountered before. He was at the desk. He looked up when she came in. She closed the door behind her, which she had not done before. They had always left it open. In the established way of the study mornings and working evenings, he registered the door. She came to stand in front of the desk. She said, I have something to say and I need to say it before I decide not to. He put down what he was holding and he gave her his full attention, which was the thing he did best and that she had never once taken for granted. She said, I've been doing an accounting. He said, Tell me. She said, I started the ledger the day my father told me about the arrangement. I've been updating it every day since. The debits were significant at the beginning, and I want to be honest about that. The life I had been building, the apartment, the clients, the version of the future I had assembled. Those were real things, that were real losses, and they went in the debit column, and they're still there, and they're going to stay there because an honest ledger doesn't erase its entries. He said, I know, she said, but I've been running the credit column for 62 days, and the credit column it is the most complete accounting I have ever produced. The breakfasts with the moving light, the study at 7:30 with the mutual quiet, the library chair that is now mine, in the way that things become yours through use rather than transaction, the East Garden that is going to be finished, the heron market, which I would not want unhappened, even knowing the consequences, because it produced what it produced. Caris Holden saying you chose correctly. She stopped. He was looking at her with the third expression, the one that was not the ledger and not the library look, but the one she had been cataloguing since the drawing room, which she now had enough data to identify. It was, she thought, the expression of a person who was being seen accurately, and who had not been seen accurately in a very long time. She said, I'm not telling you the credit column is bigger than the debit column. I'm telling you that the credit column is real and that I've been honest about building it, and that the sum is that I want to stay here. Not because the arrangement requires it, and not because the alternatives are insufficient, because I want to, he said. Sera, she said. Yes, he said. I am aware that I have not. He stopped. She waited. He said, the when is difficult for me. You know that. She said, I know. She said, I'm not asking you to change the when right now. I'm telling you what's in the ledger so that you have the information in your model and can update accordingly. He looked at her. He said, my model needs significant updating. She said, I know that too. He said, can I? He stopped again. She waited. He said, may I ask you something? She noted the phrasing. 3 words at the beginning that referenced 3 other words. On the first night, she said, yes. He said, the East Garden. You told Caris Holden it would be finished in spring. She said, yes. He said, will you design it with her? The finishing. You both understand its original structure and what it was meant for. She looked at him. She said, that's not the question you were going to ask. He said, no. It's a related one that I found easier. She said, ask the harder one. He was quiet for a moment. With the held breath quiet that she knew now was the quiet of a man who knew exactly what he wanted to say and was locating the courage for the when. He said, I think the house being more correct with you in it I think that is understatement. I think the accurate version of the statement is that the house has not been correct since Elena died, and I had accepted that as the permanent condition. And you have changed a fact I thought was fixed, and I want to say something about that is commensurate with what it is, and I haven't been able to locate the right form for it. She said, you've just said it. He said, that wasn't, she said. It was exactly it. You just described what it is with complete accuracy and without performing it, which is the only form worth using. He looked at her. She said, for what it's worth. The accurate version from my side is that I have been building things in the margins of other people's structures my entire life. And this is the first time I am building something that is entirely mine and that I chose. And the choosing feels like what I imagine good architecture feels like from the inside. Not the building someone else designed and that you maintain. The building you understood and committed to, and that tells the truth about what was genuinely known when it was made. He was quiet for a long moment. He said, that's exactly what good architecture feels like from the inside. She said, I know. I have been learning that here. She said, I'm going to bed. He said, "All right." She turned toward the door. She said, "Emeric." He said, "Yes." She said, "Come to the door yourself tonight. Don't wait for me to come through." He said, "Yes." She went upstairs. She waited. He knocked at 9:47. She opened the door. Spring came to the estate in the specific way that spring came to places that had been waiting for it for a long time, not gradually, but suddenly, in the way of things that have been building toward themselves invisibly, and then arrive all at once. She had been in the house for 4 months and some days, and she had watched the grounds shift from winter to the edge of spring the way she watched the morning light shift from one quality to another as evidence of time passing, as data about where she was, as the particular information that a system gave you when you were paying sufficient attention to it. She had been paying attention. The grounds told her a great deal. The East Garden was being completed. She and Karis Holden had spent 3 afternoons with Elena's original design and with the 2 landscape architects Emeric had engaged. And she had found, in those afternoons, that Elena's instincts had been as good as Aldrich had suggested the load distribution in the garden's structural elements, the way the planned paths distributed foot traffic through the space, the specific placement of the taller plantings to create weather protection without blocking the eastern light at the morning hours. The garden was designed to be used in. She had understood the design the way she understood good accounting, by following its logic and finding it consistent, by arriving at the same conclusion the designer had arrived at through the structure of the thing rather than the description of it. She had said this to Karis on the 2nd afternoon, and Karis had been quiet for a moment and then said, "She would have liked you," in the specific tone of a statement that was not a social grace but a genuine assessment. And Sera had received it in the same spirit and had not known what to do with it except to set it in the ledger in the category she had been developing for things that did not fit the existing categories, but that were clearly real. She had been developing that category for months. It was becoming the most important one in the ledger. Emeric came to the study doorway one morning in early April, not to come in, just to stand in the doorway with the quality of someone who had something to say and had found the right when she looked up from the accounts. He said, "The garden will be ready on Thursday." She said, "The opening," he said, "if you want to call it that." She said, "I'll tell Karis Holden." He said, "Already told her. She'll bring 3 people she wants to." She said, "Good." He said, I wanted to say something." She put down her pen and she gave him the same quality of attention he had given her in the library on the night she said she wanted to stay. She said, "Tell me," he said, "the night you came to the study and told me what was in the credit column. I have thought about what the accurate version of my response would have been if the when had been more available to me." She said, "Yes," he said. "The accurate version is I had 4 criteria for what I was going to do with my life after Elena. The first 3 were structural operational continuity, organizational stability, the specific shape of the work. The 4th was the one I had decided was not available and had stopped, including in the model." She said, "What was it?" He said, "Someone who was in the world honestly, who moved toward what needed to be moved toward without calculating whether the movement was safe, who understood structures from the inside rather than from their descriptions." He said, "I thought I had removed that criterion from the model because it was not a realistic parameter. Then I saw you at the Heron Market and I had to reintroduce it, because I had found an instance of it and I could not, in honest accounting, continue to treat it as unavailable." She looked at him in the doorway. She said, "You reintroduced the criterion and then found a mechanism to meet it." He said, "Yes." She said, That's the most you thing I've ever heard. He said. I know, she said. Come sit down. He came in. He sat in the chair across from her Aldrich's chair. The chair for significant things, she said. Tell me the accurate version of what you would have said that night. He said. The accurate version is, I love you. I have been building vocabulary for saying it with the correct precision and the correct honesty, and the when has been consistently unavailable to me. This is the specific limitation I am working on, and I want you to know I am working on it specifically because it matters to you, which is a new reason for me to work on things, and one I am learning the weight of. She looked at him. She said, That's specific. He said, You told me you wanted the specific version. She said, Yes. She said, The specific version from my side is I didn't come here to love anyone. I came here to survive an arrangement and to build what I could in the margins of it. I have been here 4 months, and I am not in the margins anymore, and I am not surviving an arrangement. I am in the center of something I chose, and I am in love with the person who understood that the honest life was the only kind available to someone who understood structures from the inside. He said, Sera. She said, Yes. He said, May I? He said it, and he did not finish the sentence in the same way he had not finished it on the first night, the first time, and she understood. With the complete legibility he had said she possessed, exactly what was being asked. And she thought about the first night, and the white dress, and the window, and the 3 words, and what they had meant, and what they still meant, and what they were always going to mean. And she said, Yes. He crossed the room, and the study. Their study, the one organized by a 14-year-old boy, who was still in architecture at 37, held them both in the East April morning light. And she thought, This is what the honest structure feels like from the inside. This is what it feels like when the building tells the truth about what was genuinely known when it was made. She thought, I know exactly what was genuinely known. She thought, this is it. She thought about courage on the morning the East Garden opened. She stood at the window of the study, their study. Unequivocally, their study. In the way that all spaces in the house had been becoming unequivocally theirs over 4 months and some days. And she looked at the completed garden below, and she thought about what courage actually was, and what it was not. It was not the absence of fear. She had been afraid on the first evening, standing at the window in the white dress that was the most dishonest thing about the evening. And she had been afraid of what she did not know, and what she could not control, and what she had not chosen, and what it was going to require of her. She had been afraid, and she had said yes anyway, the first time, and all the times after yes to the study at 7:30, yes to the East dining room breakfast, yes to the events and the room reading and the Heron Market truth told publicly, and the credit column and the words in the doorway, and the one that was still the most significant, the one on the first night when 3 words had asked a real question and she had given a real answer, and everything had turned on that pivot. Courage, she had learned, was not the absence of the calculation. She was always going to calculate. It was the structure of her mind, the specific way she understood the world. And she would not and should not try to remove it. Courage was saying yes while the calculation was still running. It was moving toward the child while her mind was still assessing whether the probabilities warranted it. It was walking through the adjoining door on her own initiative before she had fully arrived at the conclusion that she should. It was telling him what was in the credit column before she had determined whether telling him was strategically correct. It was being willing to be legible in a room where legibility was supposed to be a vulnerability. Courage was the specific quality of a person who trusted their own accounting enough to act on it before the final column was totaled. She looked at the East Garden below. at Caris Holden in the garden with her 3 people, at the completed design with its good load distribution and its paths that moved correctly and its taller plantings that protected without blocking the morning light. She looked at Elena's design, finished at last, and she thought, this is what it looks like when something is completed honestly, not without cost, not without the record of what it cost in the ledger, but complete and accurate, and telling the truth about what was genuinely known when it was built. She thought about 3 words asked and 3 words answered, and she thought that the asking and the answering were both acts of courage, the asking because it was visible, and the answering because it was irrevocable. And she thought that irrevocable was not a frightening word if the accounting was honest, because an honest ledger knew exactly what it had committed and why, and did not need to revise the entry later. She had entered the yes. She was not going to revise it. She was going to build on it. The way you built on a foundation that you had verified was solid, continuously, adding load as the structure proved it could hold it. Trusting the system because the system was honest. She thought, this is the most correct thing I have ever built. She thought, I am going to keep building it. She thought, the when will continue to improve, and the what is already exactly right. And the who is the person I have chosen, fully, and with complete information, and the choice is mine to have made, and it is the best accounting I have ever done. She stepped away from the window. She went to find him. The east garden was open. It was spring. The house was correct. The opening of the garden was a small event, which was the right size for it. Caris Holden brought 3 people, a landscape historian she knew from an earlier professional life, a woman who had been Elena's closest friend before the marriage and who had not been back to the estate since the funeral, and a young man who was Caris's nephew and who had recently begun studying design and who, Sera thought, absorbed the garden. The way that people absorbed things they would spend the next several years understanding fully and without performance, as if the understanding were happening below the level of expression and would surface later in his own work. She observed all of them with the attention she brought to everything, and she thought about what it meant to bring people back to a space that had been closed and to have the space receive them. And she thought that spaces received or rejected based on whether they were complete, and that the garden was complete, and that the reception felt like the right kind. Aldrich stood at the edge of the garden for most of the afternoon, not quite inside it, in the way of a person who was present at something he had witnessed the absence of for a long time, and who was processing the presence of it without performing the processing. She went to stand beside him at some point in the 2nd hour. She said, "He told me you've been here for 11 years. He said, 12 in September. She said, you watched him through the period after Elena. He said, yes. She said, what was it like? He said, like watching someone learn to operate correctly with a part of the system that had stopped working. You learn to compensate. You get very efficient at the compensation, and then someone comes along and, instead of being something else to compensate around, they fix the part." She said, "I haven't fixed anything." He said, "No, you've restored function, which is different from repair, because the thing doing the restoring has to be the right fit." She looked at the garden. She said, "Do you think I'm the right fit?" He said, "I've thought you were the right fit since the morning you came to the library and told me my description of your situation was diplomatic." She said, "That was your first impression." He said, "My first impressions are very accurate. That's the operational skill." She said, "I know." She said, "Aldrich." He said, "Yes." She said, "Thank you. For the library. For what you didn't say and what you did." He said, "You did the work." She said, "With the right information, At the right time, he said. That's what good information is for. She looked at the garden. She thought about the right information at the right time and about what she had been building with it. And she thought that the ledger she had been keeping was the longest and most complete accounting she had ever produced, and that it was still open, and that it was the most accurate picture of anything she had ever understood. She said, "Thank you for the 12 years you gave him before I arrived." He looked at her. He said, "That's a generous framing." She said, "It's an accurate one." He said, "Yes, I suppose it is." They stood at the edge of the garden in the April light, and they did not say anything else, which was its own form of completion. She found him at the far end of the garden in the late afternoon, near the section with the tall plantings that protected without blocking, in the place where the design's structural intention was most fully realized. He was not performing anything, he was simply there, in the garden, in the way of a person who was in a space and was present in it, without the management that structured most of his presence in most spaces. She came to stand beside him, and they looked at the completed garden together, and neither of them spoke for a while. And the speaking was not necessary because the thing they were both looking at said everything that needed to be said about what had been started, and what had been lost, and what had been finished, and what was continuing. She said, "Eventually, the landscape historian is very good." He said, "Karis chooses well." She said, "You chose correctly." He said, "She told you that," she said, "at the council session, before we knew we were going to win." He said, "Before we knew." She said the "we" deliberately, and she thought he heard it, and she thought that was all right. He said, "Sera," she said. "Yes," he said, "I want to show you something." He led her to the east-facing corner of the garden, the corner that caught the morning light first. There was a small plaque set into the garden wall, stone, with lettering that was simple and clean. She read it. It said Emeric Vale, who designed this space. And below that, in a different line, in the same cut, completed in the first spring. She looked at the plaque. She said, "When did you do this?" he said. "When you said we should finish it." It was the plaque was what made the finishing real rather than just a construction project. She said, "That's the right distinction." He said, "I thought so." She touched the stone. She said, "First spring suggests there will be a second." He said, "Yes." She said, "And a third." He said, "Yes." She said, "It's an open-ended framing." He said, "It was intended to be." She looked at him. He looked at her. She said, "Good." She looked back at the garden. She said, "The young man Karis brought. Her nephew. He's going to be excellent." He said, "How do you know?" She said, "He stood in the center of the garden for 20 minutes, doing nothing visible. He was understanding the load distribution." He said, "How do you know that's what he was doing?" She said, "Because that's what I would have been doing." He said, "Yes." He said, "You're going to know a great many things about people I've never been able to know." She said, "Different tools, same information, arrived at differently." He said, "The model needs to incorporate your methods." She said, "I know. We've been working on it." He said, "We have been." He said the "we" with the same deliberateness she had used, and she thought that they were both practicing the word, and she thought that practice was the honest way to learn anything, and she thought that the learning was very good. She looked at the plaque and the garden and the April light, and she thought this is the first spring. She thought there will be many more. She thought I am exactly where I should be, and I am here by choice. And the choice is mine, and it is correct, and it is the best accounting I have ever done. And I intend to keep the books honestly for as long as the ledger is open. She thought, that is a very long time. She thought, good. Pond. The evening of the garden opening. After Caris Holden and her 3 people had gone, and Aldrich had retreated to wherever Aldrich retreated when the day's events were complete, she and Emeric sat in the east drawing room by the fire, which was the same fire as on the 17th evening when she had asked him to tell her something he hadn't told anyone in this house, and which had become, over the months, something she associated with the specific quality of conversations that were available in this room, and not in any other. She said, "Tell me something true," he said. About what she said. Anything. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I have been afraid, for most of my adult life, that the things I was capable of wanting were not things that were compatible with the life I had chosen to build, and that this was a fact I had accepted, and that the acceptance was the correct response." She said, "And now," he said, "now I think the acceptance was a premature conclusion reached on insufficient data." She said, "The data improved." He said, "Substantially." She said, "Tell me something else." He said, "I read the section on domestic architecture last week. In the library system. I had been in commercial architecture for 2 months." She said, "You changed the order." He said, "I was more interested in what was ahead of it." She said, "What does domestic architecture say?" He said, "That the most significant structural element of a domestic space is not the foundation or the walls, but the quality of use. That a house becomes what is consistently done within it over time, and that the quality of the consistent doing determines whether the structure is load-bearing or merely decorative." She looked at the fire. She said, "I think we are consistently doing something of quality." He said, "Yes, I think so too." She said, "Tell me one more thing." He said, 3 in a row. She said, "Indulge me." He said, "All right." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "On the morning after the first night, I crossed something out on the card I left for you." She said, "I noticed." He said, "I wrote that last night was, and then I found that the word that came naturally was the most accurate word, and also the one I wasn't ready to use in the 3rd line of a note left on a breakfast tray." She said, "What was the word?" He said, "Important." She looked at the fire. She thought about the card and the crossed-out line and the good morning that had replaced it, and she thought about important and what it meant, and she thought, "Yes, that is the word. That is exactly the word." She said, "You were right that it was accurate." He said, "I know that now." She said, "Use it going forward." He said, "I intend to." She said, "Good." She looked at the fire for a while longer. She thought about the ledger, open and accumulating entries that were honest and real and clearly in the correct column. She thought about 3 words asked on a first night, and 3 words answered, and the shape of everything that had followed from those 6 words. All of it. Every breakfast, and every study, morning, and every session, and every garden, and every conversation in which the when finally arrived, and the what was exactly right. She thought, "This is the most honest accounting I have ever produced." She thought, "I am not going to close the ledger." She thought, "The house is correct, and I am in it, and I chose to be here, and the choice is mine, and that is the most load-bearing fact in the entire structure." She stayed by the fire until the fire had given all it had. Then she stood, and he stood, and they went upstairs together through the house that was theirs, and the house held them both in the specific way of structures that are honest precisely, completely, as if they had been designed for exactly this use, which they had not been, and which made it all the more remarkable that they fit so well. She woke in the morning of the day after the garden opening, the day after the fire, and the important and the going upstairs together through the house with the specific quality of clarity that she had come to recognize as the quality of mornings when something had been settled into its correct place. Not resolved in the sense of finished. Settled in the sense of having found its structure, its accurate home in the ledger. She looked at the east ceiling, and she thought about the ledger, and she thought, I know exactly what this is. I have always known, since approximately the 17th day, what this was becoming. I have been very careful about when I allowed myself to know it, because the knowing carried consequences and I was building the foundation before I put weight on it. She thought the foundation is solid. She thought the weight is appropriate for what's been built. She thought, update the ledger with the final entry of the opening period and begin the new one. She got up. She went to the east window. Below, the garden was visible in the April morning light, and it was complete. And it was beautiful in the way that things with good structural logic were beautiful, not decoratively, but essentially, in the way of things that were exactly what they needed to be. She thought about the plaque first spring. She thought, and a second, and a third. She thought yes. She went to the study. He was not there yet. It was 6:45, and he arrived at 6, which meant he had not yet arrived, which she had not expected, and which was its own small data point, pleasant and unremarkable, the kind of data point that accumulates in a household that has become correctly itself. She sat in her chair, and she opened the accounts, and she began. 7 minutes later she heard him on the stairs and then the study door, and he came in and he sat at the desk, and they were in the study at morning in the east light, and neither of them said good morning, because they were past the formality of good morning, and both of them knew what the morning was without the naming of it. She thought, this is what it means to know the grammar. She thought, I have been learning it for 4 months, and I am still learning, and I am going to be learning it for a very long time, and the learning is the most interesting thing I have undertaken. She looked at the accounts. The accounts were, as always, honest. She thought everything in this room is honest. She thought I am exactly where I should be. She thought the ledger is correct. She kept working. Outside the east window, the first spring continued, certain of what it was, moving at its own pace, doing exactly what it had always been going to do. She thought, in the quiet of the study with the accounts open and him at the desk across from her, about the question that had framed the first night, not as it had appeared on the surface, which was about a dress and the mechanics of its 12 buttons, but as what it actually was, which was the first honest question that had been asked of her, in a context where the answer genuinely determined what happened next. She had been asked things before. Parents asked, employers asked, the world asked, in the general way that the world asked, and she had answered all of it with the evenness of a woman who had learned that evenness was the most efficient way to move through spaces that were not quite hers. But she had not been asked in the way that required a real answer, not the polite answer, not the functional answer, not the answer that smoothed the interaction toward its next expected stage. She had been asked, and the asking had been real, and the answering had been real, and everything that followed had been built on those two real things. She thought, that is the architecture of trust. Not the trust that is assumed or taken or managed into existence, but the trust that begins with a question that takes the other person's answer seriously, that would stop or continue, based entirely on what the answer was. She thought, I want to ask and be asked like that for the rest of my life. She thought, I am. She looked at the accounts. She worked. The study was quiet. The house was correct. The ledger was open and honest and still accumulating. And she thought, good. That is exactly right. That is the only kind of accounting worth doing.